Hi, and welcome to the Deadly Digest. I'm your host, Delaney Bartlett, true crime and horror writer. And for this episode, we're going to be talking about the Phantom Killer of Texarkana, and we're joined by friends of yours truly and of the show, Amy Cotham and her brother, Chris Cotham. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
So, you guys both grew up in Texarkana, right? So, do you want to talk a little bit about why you were interested in this case?
Yeah, pretty much all of our family members and everybody we knew who was our parents' age or grandparents' age knew about the case, and they were very happy to share details of it. It also, they had done a film version about the story just a couple of years, not very long after I was born. So it was very much in the public consciousness when I was very little. So I've heard about it all my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Same for you?
Yeah, our grandparents were young, and they would talk about the town. And it really, I think the name of the film based on it is The Town That Dreaded Sundown.
Right, which we will talk about in part 3.
Yeah. I think that's a very apt description because they talked about how literally you're supposed to go home at night and lock your doors, and just how the town used to feel really mostly safe. But then eventually everyone was really scared at the time of the murders because they never caught him. And at the time, the murders kept happening, and people were very afraid.
Yeah. So that kind of brings me to the town itself, because it's got kind of an interesting geographical characteristic that kind of factors into, I think, why maybe the killer was able to get away with it. Do one of you guys want to talk a little bit about what makes Texarkana special?
Yes, it's split over 2 states. It's technically 2 cities, the way it's...
Twin cities.
Yes, the Twin Cities.
Okay.
It's half in Texas, half in Arkansas, although the Texas side's just outgrown the Arkansas side. But it's one city, but each side of it has its own separate government.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you have 2 mayors, 2 police forces, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Things like that. 2 sets of liquor laws on each side of the state line. You know, you have inconsistencies like that. So it's a little awkward or unwieldy sometimes when they try to coordinate.
It's also a strange place where several highways, it's a juncture of like several major thoroughfares that pass through the nation, kind of cross each other there. So you get a lot of drifters. It also used to be a huge railroad hub, and just a lot of transients that go through the area and don't stick around.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to ask about, is there tends to be this sort of, I guess, urban legend, or the mythology is that Texarkana was just this sleepy little safe town, but maybe that wasn't entirely true?
Not so much.
It's
Apparently,
always
at one point it was known as like the Chicago of the South, or Little Chicago. So there was a lot of gambling and vice and stuff like that downtown where the railroads were. My granddad, our granddad, I guess, worked, and his dad worked for the railroad, so I would hear all kinds of stories about that when I was little.
Right. And like during the 40s, right after the war, it was kind of going through a boom time.
Definitely. I think the country as a whole was a little more optimistic, and people were trying to move on from World War II. And so certainly a happy time, and it was a place, the cliche is people didn't lock their doors at night. And I think there was certainly that seedy part of town. But generally, I think people felt safe and happy, and it being in the South, it's in the Bible Belt as well. So there was a lot of more conservative, a lot of people that I felt like felt like the town was really safe.
Even with the influx of sort of transients and new people coming in for like work at the railroad, like you said, or there's also like an Army munitions depot there.
There is, yeah.
Yes, Red River Army Depot.
Okay, so
I don't know how long it's been there, but I'm assuming at least World War II.
yeah, it was, according to the research I did, it was there, during that time, and it was one of the, places that I guess was a lure for people to come and work. It was a big employer, I guess, of some, and I guess with it being a government employer, that tends to be like the better jobs, better benefits, whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, what I'd like to do for this episode is just sort of dive into the facts of the case without necessarily going into like the investigation yet. We'll save that for part 2, if you don't mind. So I want to start with the first case that we know of. And this was February 22nd, 1946. 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry. They had gone to see a movie downtown and afterwards had gone parking on a secluded lover's lane. Do you have some more details you want to share?
I know it was a pretty violent and sexual assault on her, and I feel like you have some good information about, I don't know if you wanted to go over some of
Sure.
what happened.
So they actually survived, and this is the story that they told, was that about 10 minutes after they got there to this secluded road that was kind of private, they said that a man approached the driver's side and told them to get out of the car. And at first, they kind of thought it was just a prank, but the man had some kind of a mask or a pillowcase or something over his face, and he had a gun. And that's when they knew, okay, this is not a prank. So he tells them to get out of the vehicle, and they do. And so once they're out of the vehicle, they tell Hollis to take his pants off. And so he does, because this guy's got a gun. And Mary Jean Larry is thinking this is a robbery. So she's like trying to show the attacker his wallet, like, we don't have any money, see? And the attacker just knocks Hollis over the head really hard, like cracking his skull, multiple skull fractures. He tells Larry to start running, so she does, and she kind of heads towards like a ditch where there's maybe some trees for cover, but he tells her no, go a different direction, so she changes direction, and she sees a car, so she starts heading towards this car, hoping there's some people inside, but it's empty, and the attacker catches up with her and is like, why are you running? And she said, because you told me to, and he called her a liar, and then proceeded to sexually assault her with the gun. After it was over, she ran to a nearby house and called the police. Luckily, her boyfriend Hollis survived. He was able to kind of come to after a few minutes, and he flagged down a car and got help. And so they told the police what had happened to them. And as far as we know, this is the first attack of this killer. But he hasn't killed anyone yet. He's just attacked and sexually assaulted a girl.
I do think it speaks to the fact that it was just like a psychological game for him to catch people off guard and to toy with them, and that he was a very sadistic person. So
Yeah.
I think that's the first inkling of that.
Yeah, and they had different sort of descriptions. So Hollis said he didn't really get a good look at the guy, but he thought he was maybe a white guy or might have been a light-skinned black guy, he wasn't sure. But Larry, who I think probably was much closer to him, she thought he was a black man, even though his face was covered. So, there was a little bit of a discrepancy there, which is important for later when we talk about the investigation. So 4 weeks later, we have another attack. This time, early in the morning of March 24th, 1946, some motorists found at the end of this, again, secluded road, they find a car with two people inside. At first, they think they're sleeping, but when they go inside and look, they find the bodies of 29-year-old Richard Griffin and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore. They had been shot multiple times, and there was so much blood, it had, collected in the floorboard and had flowed out into the running boards. So now he has escalated from attacking couples to now killing. So Griffin was found between the front seats of the car, and he was on his knees. He'd been shot multiple times, and his pockets had been turned inside out. So again, maybe there's that, they thought it was a robbery. Moore was lying face down in the back seat, and she had been shot in the back of the head. Griffin had also been shot in the back of the head as well, but he had more gunshot wounds. When the police were searching around, they found a cartridge shell
Yeah.
of a .32 automatic pistol, and they found kind of nearby the scene, the car, they found it like this area that was kind of disturbed, like there had been a scuffle of some kind and blood in this area. And so there's a kind of a controversy over whether or not Moore was sexually assaulted. Apparently there was a lot of rumor that she had been, but then researchers say, well, we don't see any reports of this.
Interestingly enough, in some of the research I did, there's no record that they ever tested the bodies for that, or
Right.
there's no, I don't know if they weren't tested or if there was no record. A lot of the records have disappeared regardless over the
Right.
years. They're all missing. But yeah, and they tried to keep that out. I don't know if it was out of respect for the victims, because that would have been very
Yeah.
shocking, but also considered disrespectful to share that information with the public at the time.
Right.
But
There
then
was
the
a big
police,
stigma
yeah,
attached
there
to
was a
it.
huge stigma attached to it. But then the police would use this phrases like he's a pervert, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if they used the term sex fiend when they would talk about him in press conferences. So that was another reason people were really thought that they were probably some
Right.
sexual assaults.
The coverage and the reports from the police and Texas Rangers were very sensationalistic, and some people may have imagined more than might have really happened just based
Right.
on that. But,
Well, I did see a documentary about it, and they interviewed Moore's father, and he said that when the police informed him of her death, that they told him that she had been raped. So coming from him, I think he was probably, I mean, that's who I'm going to believe.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why it was a controversy and maybe there weren't reports about it was like you said,
I agree.
it was like considered to be more respectful to the victim because there was such a stigma attached to it. So I'm going to go from the
Yeah.
premise that she was in fact sexually assaulted based on that.
Also based on the first crime where there weren't murders, but clearly that was in his.
Part of his MO,
Yeah.
yeah. But you were right, they weren't ever really, they weren't examined by a pathologist or anything like that.
Not for
So,
those details.
I have no idea what the state of forensics were in the 40s.
That's true.
Or,
yeah. I mean, but they did have pathologists. I mean, it
Yeah.
was,
I mean, they must have. But
yeah, but
small town Texarkana.
Yeah,
and
keep in
just,
mind.
Yeah, it's tough to say.
Also, they sent, information to the state crime lab. One piece of evidence showed up, 30 years later, finally came back. So there were a lot of, I think we'll get to that later. There were a lot of holes in the investigation. So,
yeah, for sure. And so, but at this point, like that whole hysteria and thing that you were talking about, that still hadn't quite happened yet because the first attacks weren't really, sensationalized or publicized very much. And this is the first double murder, which certainly is tragic, but, it's just kind of seen as an isolated incident at this point. Yeah. But then we get 3 weeks later, and that's when 16-year-old saxophonist Betty Jo Booker, and she was getting a ride home. She had been playing at the VFW with her band, the Rhythmaires, and the gig had kind of gone long and had gone into about 1:30 in the morning, and she got a ride home from a longtime friend of hers named Paul Martin, who was 16. And when they left that VFW, that was the last time anyone saw them alive. And she did have her saxophone with her, which is an important point. And it was just before dawn that same day, they left at 1:30 in the morning. And so a few hours later, there had been some travelers who were going through Texarkana, and they went through Spring Lake Park. And that's when they saw Paul Martin's body on the side of the road, shot. And, the park, and you'll have to help me with this, but it's in town, right? It's like in the town.
It is in town. Well, it's in
Yeah.
town now. I'm not sure how secluded or,
Well,
it's right in the middle of town now.
yeah, at the time though it would have been kind of on the outskirts.
Okay.
And even now there's some areas around there that aren't real well traveled or well paved or urbanized or whatever.
Lots of dirt roads through there,
Right.
too. Yeah.
So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to say it was dark and secluded, even though it
very
was.
much so.
Yeah,
And
okay.
wooded, so that always is.
Right.
There-
Right.
I doubt there would have been any kind of street lights at the time.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that fits again with that same MO. So they found his body lying on his side on North Park Road, shot multiple times. And again, they found evidence that it was from a .32 automatic Colt pistol. When they searched the area, they noticed a disturbed area with some blood kind of further down the road, very similar to the earlier crime scenes, pointing to a struggle perhaps. And then they found her body about 2 miles away. It took them quite a while to find it. It wasn't until like 11:30 a.m. they found her, and she was in this very odd position where she looked like she had been staged. Her coat was buttoned all the way up to her neck, and her hand was in her pocket. Like you were saying, you saw the crime scene
Yeah,
photos.
they're very startling. It's, we're used to old photos, but maybe not old crime photos. And just from the look of it, it looks like she had just decided to take a nap under a tree or something out in the grass. It's just very startling to think that that's a dead person when you see it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not. It's hard to tell if she was staged, but yeah, it looks very posed.
Yeah, because she had been shot twice.
I saw the crime scene photos. It's very startling to see them. You're accustomed to old photos and what they look like, but not when they're from a crime or of dead people. And she does look very posed and almost peaceful, like she just decided to take a nap under a tree with her hand in her pocket.
Right, but she had been shot twice. She'd been shot in the chest and in the face. So clear, to me, it's really, I think, clear that her body was staged to look that way.
Oh, yes.
That did not look natural at all. So,
I think it harkens back to the psychological quirks of the killer and like what did that mean to him and why and
yeah, this is not just
yeah.
a
It's not
robbery
just a
gone
robbery,
wrong.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So in forensic examinations, the body showed that they had put up a struggle with their killer, and they said Booker had been sexually assaulted in the same manner as Moore. So again, we have another clue that Moore probably was sexually assaulted. And so now we're really kind of starting to see the pattern. And this is where you start to see the ramping up of the fear.
Definitely.
But it wasn't until I believe this next one, which ended up being the final, which we'll talk about more, the Starkses on May 3rd, 1946. So this was a very different kind of crime. They were both 36 years old. They lived on a large farm about 10 miles outside of town on the Arkansas side.
This is the only one, I believe, of the crimes that occurred on the Arkansas side.
Oh, okay.
Although that wouldn't have really mattered as far as you don't think about where the state line is. But yeah.
Yeah, but it is
for
a
the record,
difference.
yeah.
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 And so it was Virgil and Katie Starks, and Virgil had been working really hard that day. His back was hurting, and so Katie had given him a heating pad for his back, and then she went to bed. And she said she had been having a hard time sleeping. She thought she was hearing noises. And, Virgil was still in the living room listening to the radio and kind of reading the paper and relaxing or whatever. And so she yelled into the living room for him to turn down the radio because she thought she heard something. And then she did hear this loud sound of breaking glass. And so she ran into the living room, and that's when she saw Virgil stand up out of his chair and then slump back down. And she ran over to him, and he had blood on his head and just died. Like, he died pretty quickly. He had been shot twice in the back of the head, and it was through a window. That was the glass breaking. And so she, of course, is like, oh my God. She runs to the phone. She's got one of those old crank phones, which I think in the 1940s was already kind of
Still a little outdated.
It's like having a landline now. Like, yeah, you can use it, but
It was a rural area as well.
Yeah, yeah. So she gets to the crank phone and she starts to crank it to try to call the police, and 2 more bullets come in and hit her in the face. But she lives, and this is what's really incredible. She's been shot twice in the face. She starts to kind of crawl away, and she hears a sound like someone's trying to get through the back door or trying to cut the screen or something. She doesn't see the attacker, which is important, but she hears that he's like trying to get in or something. So she runs out of the house and runs to, I believe, like a cousin's house across the highway. And she's just in her nightgown, which is soaked in blood. She's leaving, the police described it as a river of blood everywhere she goes. She goes across the street to her cousin's house, but no one's home.
No one's home yet at the first place.
Yeah, and believes she's been shot in the face twice. Like,
Yeah.
literally, her teeth have been blown out. And she runs another 50 yards down the road to some more neighbors. I mean, this woman is incredible, if you ask me. And the neighbors, thankfully, were home, and they were able to alert the police and, call the ambulance and everything. And this is, they immediately were like, this is the Phantom Killer. This is the last strike. Well, they didn't say last, but, this is the Phantom
most
Killer.
recent.
Yes, yeah.
So, and now we have where we've got 4 different attacks attributed to this same killer. 5 people have been murdered, and 3 women, possibly maybe only 2, have been sexually assaulted by this guy, the mysterious Phantom Killer. So that's going to wrap up for this part where we talk about just the crimes, but we're going to come back in part 2 and talk about the investigations and the effect that it had on the town. So come back next week for the Deadly Digest.